مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. بعد أقل من شهر من تحقيق أعظم انتصاراته في مجال السياسة الخارجية، وهو الفوز بموافقة عدد كاف من أعضاء الكونغرس على اتفاق إيران النووي، تحاصر الرئيس أوباما أزمة من أزمات السياسة الخارجية، لما لا يقل عن 60 عاما. ومنذ أيام حلف بغداد كان أحد المبادئ الأساسية للسياسة الخارجية الأميركية إبقاء الروس خارج الشرق الأوسط. الآن وللمرة الأولى منذ أن طاردت مصر الزوار غير المرغوب فيهم عام 1972، أدى الروس مع انتشار قوات عسكرية كبيرة في سوريا. تقول موسكو عن هدفها محاربة إرهابي الدولة الإسلامية، ولكن يبدو أن الهدف الحقيقي دعم الرئيس السوري وحليف إيران بشار الأسد، المسؤول عن مقاتل مئات الآلاف من مواطنيه بوحشي على مدار السنوات الأربعة الماضية. ما المفترض بأمريكا فعله؟ الانضمام إلى روسيا في الحرب على داعش؟ معارضة روسيا لأن موسكو تساعد رئيسا نعتبره مجرم حرب؟ هل ستجعل روسيا وضع الحرب الأهلية السورية أفضل أم أسوأ؟ كيف سيؤثر هذا على اتفاق إيران النووي؟ وكيف سيستجيب حلفاء أمريكا الأخيرون في الشرق الأوسط للظهور المفاجئ لروسيا كطرف فاعل رئيسي وسط الصراع الأشد فتكا في المنطقة؟ لمناقشة هذه القضية الحرجة يسرني أن أرحب باللجنة المكونة من خبيري السياسة الخارجية نظرة ودينيس روس. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting here with our panel of foreign policy experts to discuss the latest in the challenge to America in the Middle East. It was only recently that President Obama scored his biggest foreign policy victory of his administration, the Iran nuclear agreement. And then virtually the next day, Russia sends military personnel, planes and naval forces to Syria, totally upstaging American efforts in this part of the world. So tell me, gentlemen, first, Dennis, what is Putin's strategy?
Well, I don't know that Putin has a real strategy other than wanting to demonstrate that no decision anywhere gets resolved in foreign policy or national security on the world stage without Russia. On Syria, he is acting to demonstrate that he will be the arbiter, Russia will be the arbiter of what happens there. If there's going to be any political process, he's writing the ground rules. He's making it clear that he has the leverage and nothing, in a sense, is going to go forward or move in any direction without him. I think that's one important element. Larger strategic elements to drive him are, I think, not necessarily well put together, other than being a player on the world stage. And an important element of this for him, a corollary of this, is he still believes in a kind of payback. He still resents the way America acted in the 1990s when it was kind of there was a unipolar world and he felt we took advantage of Russian weakness. Now, in a sense, he's taking advantage of perceived American weakness. I say perceived American weakness. If you look at the 1990s, the Russians really were weak. We're not weak today, but there's a perception that we are weak, and he's exploiting that perception. I think the timing of what he did in Syria was certainly driven by what was happening to the Assad regime and the increasing deterioration of its position. But the point you made about the timing in terms of upstaging us should not be dismissed. He does not like it when it looks like America is driving any particular policy. The Iran focus was almost entirely on us, and he's moved very quickly to shift the attention away from us, make it clear he's the player, and he's sending a message that some of our friends may be odious, But the one thing about us is we stand by our friends, and the contrast with the United States, certainly in the Middle East, is very striking.
So, Juan, there's a series of mixed messages from our administration. Some seem to vehemently oppose what the Russians are doing. Other messages aren't so critical or negative. How do you read the American response to what Putin is doing in Syria?
Well, this is in part the brilliance of the Putin move, even though it's tactical and sometimes herky-jerky. I think what he's forced the United States to do is to reshape its own narrative. And I think you've heard varying voices. You've heard the argument that this is simply throwing gasoline on the fire, that the Russians are going to cause greater instability, going to certainly give greater power and longevity to the Assad regime. And all of this is to no one's benefit. On the other hand, you've had arguments, and I've heard this from officials directly, that perhaps Russia, if they do go after ISIS, can be a very helpful partner. Why not allow them to have a parallel role, if you will, with the coalition? But the reality is the United States is having to adapt its narrative to what Russia is reshaping on the ground. They're reshaping the facts on the ground by introducing their military power and might. They're reshaping the alliance structure. Now you have the discussions around an Iraqi, Iranian, Syrian, Russian alliance, information sharing and defense of the Assad regime. He's changing the international legal legitimacy narrative. That is to say, they are now arguing, you've heard this from Foreign Minister Lavrov explicitly, that these are legitimate actions, that the U.S. actions in many ways over the years have been illegitimate, ill-conceived, and haven't been beneficial to the international community. Instead, they're working on behalf of state sovereignty and their allies. And I think ultimately Putin realizes there is this vacuum of leadership and that the region will respond to action and that Russia will have to be the centerpiece. And finally, as Dennis said rightly, that Moscow ultimately becomes the locus and the center of gravity for diplomacy. All roads lead to Moscow now. And that, in Putin's mind, is exactly where he wants to shift the power balance.
So if we're getting these mixed messages out of Washington, what should our approach be? Should we welcome Russian military involvement in Syria, or should we be trying to push it away and oppose Russian military involvement in Syria?
I think to the extent that the Russians are willing to go after the Islamic State and their hold on power, we can perhaps work with them. We have to coordinate anyway to avoid confrontation and to engage in deconfliction, which is the term to make sure our air forces, for example, don't run into each other in the Syrian airspace. And so there's no question if the Russians want to be a part of that coalition to diminish the hold of territory that ISIS holds, that's fine. The problem, though, of course, is the Russians are going to employ, and they already have employed their resources to go after all of the rebel forces attacking the Assad regime, including those that are tied to the U.S. and aligned with the U.S. And so I think that is unacceptable. And I think to the extent that the U.S. does not support its allies on the ground, this is a strategic moment. Because if we're allowing those that we've claimed to be training, supporting, buttressing, to be attacked from the air by the Russians and the Assad coalition, we have walked away from our allies and frankly walked away from particular parts of the battlefield that will allow us to influence what happens in a post-Assad Syria.
So Juan just said the Russians are killing guys that we're training. What should we be doing about this?
You know, it's clear we're not going to go in there and try to stop the Russians directly, but I think the right response, I'm not confident this is what we'll do, but the right response would be to organize actually a serious coalition right now to create a safe haven in northern Syria, make it very clear that this is an area where refugees are going to go, make it very clear that we and the European allies who have an interest in the refugees having a place to go, we're going to make sure this is no-fly, working with the Turks and others to make sure that it's policed on the ground, and in effect saying, okay, you want to play by these rules, we're playing by these rules, don't come here, don't come near this. This is going to be the basis in which to ensure that over time you can actually create more of a coherent opposition. This is going to be an opposition that is capable of fighting not only ISIS, but also building itself to take the place of the Assad regime as well. If what Putin is trying to do at this point is basically establish a set of ground rules and make it clear anyone who is opposing Assad is going to be his target, and since it's clear, ISIS only rarely engages the Assad regime, it's pretty clear that he is determined actually to try to ensure there is no other opposition than ISIS. So that's not a prescription for a political outcome. You're never going to get there anyway. So I would say compete with them, make it clear that we understand what he's doing, and now he's going to have to adjust to what we're doing.
Now, let me come back to where I began, namely the Iran nuclear agreement. One of the arguments for it is that this might lead to an Iran that is a more compliant, rule-abiding, constructive actor in other areas. Any evidence since the signing of the agreement that that's been the case in Syria, alongside with the Russian deployment?
I haven't seen evidence of that, and I think the expectation, which is playing out, is that the Iranians were going to continue to defend and to promote their interests wherever they needed to, and certainly the defense of the Assad regime has been critical to the way that they're thinking. Russian assistance, in many ways, lessened some of the pressure initially on Iran to have to put more troops on the ground, for example, or pull more Hezbollah fighting forces to defend the western coast. But I think more importantly, Rob, what this does is it puts the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal, into sharper relief. It makes it look a bit more problematic, actually, because what you have is a question as to, for example, what the 11th hour push by Russia and Iran to lift the arms and ballistic missile ban, what that really was intending as part of perhaps a broader strategy. It calls into question, why did Qasem Soleimani visit Moscow twice in violation of sanctions? Were Moscow and the Iranians planning this offensive, this coordination, this new alliance, while the talks were underway? And so what, from the American point of view, was the hopes of an agreement that would usher in a new form of alliance or potential cooperation in the Middle East may have been perhaps a cover for the Russians to begin to reformulate their position in the region along with the Iranians.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to discuss what all this means for two key questions: the flow of refugees out of Syria and how long Bashar al-Assad remains president of that war-torn country. In just a moment. Well, gentlemen, let's take this discussion that we've just had and ask some of the basic questions. Is all of this, Russian involvement, Iranian involvement, this shifting of alliances, is this more likely to make the Syrian Civil War come to an end or exacerbate it? Dennis.
I'll answer that, but let me just add to something that Juan was saying earlier. I think one of the things that Putin feared in the aftermath of the deal on the nuclear question was that, in fact, the U.S. and Iran might become closer, might become partners, and that's the last thing he wants. So in a sense, I think the whole focus of coordinating with Qasem Soleimani in advance of what is going on now was in fact part and parcel of what he was going to do in the day after, in the period after. This will not make it more likely that you come to a political outcome in Syria anytime soon. It will certainly increase the flow of refugees out because the scale of the conflict is going to become worse. It seems hard to imagine that it could become worse, but it's going to become worse, in part because the more the Russians up the ante, we're going to see that the Turks and the Saudis and others who are providing support, particularly to groups like Jaish al-Fatah, are going to actually, I think, up the ante themselves. So the net effect of this is going to be an increased flow of refugees out. It's not going to reduce that. And for Assad, it will certainly stabilize his hold on the 20% of the country that he controls right now. Maybe it can increase marginally the territory that his regime will be able to hold on to. But I don't see a fundamental change. And I do think that the basic nature of the conflict isn't going to change. The Russians are not going to put in ground troops. If you really wanted to transform this, you would decide, all right, we're going to make a major effort, we're going to commit ground forces. Putin's not going to do that. So we aren't going to see a change in the conflict itself. It's not going to hasten, in the near term at least, a political process, and it certainly is going to add to the refugee problem.
Juan, do you agree with this?
I do. I do think there's an interesting question, though, as to whether or not the Russians and the Iranians are open to a political transition that has Assad stepping aside in the medium term and having a more orderly regime transition that allows them to retain their influence and their vital interests, like the Russian port, for example, while allowing Assad to sort of go quietly into the sunset. Whether or not that's an acceptable proposition for the West, it seems like Secretary Kerry and the U.S. have been open to that kind of a political solution. And I think if the Russians provided that kind of an off-ramp, the U.S. would likely take it. I think Putin is probably taking a bit of the playbook from the chemical weapons issue, where the Russians at the 11th hour really did provide the U.S. With a face-saving way out, or at least an option out, while the Russians preserved the power of Assad, reinforced his legitimacy, at least in the short term, and ensured that they continued to be the broker. And so it may be that that becomes part of the model. But in the near term, I agree with Dennis. The conflict gets worse. The refugee crisis continues. The Assad regime, which has in some ways exacerbated the refugee crisis, not only with its barrel bombs and its atrocities, but with allowances for Syrian population to move more freely out of the country as perhaps part of a strategy, that will continue. And so the problem gets worse from a refugee perspective, and I think that puts pressure on the Europeans to try to help find a solution.
So let me ask this. A generation ago, in the last year of the Jimmy Carter administration, the Russians, then the Soviets, invaded Afghanistan, a slap in the face of Jimmy Carter. He woke up and he shifted policy. He became a lot tougher vis-a-vis the Soviets, and then led to Ronald Reagan being even tougher. What is the chance that what the Russians are doing today triggers a thorough rethinking in our White House, in the Obama administration, about dealing with the Russians and global problems more generally?
I think it's very slim. First, it's a different world. You had a bipolar world at that time, and the Russian gain was seen as an American loss. It was coming on the heels of an Iran-Iraq war and an oil crisis that made it appear as if the United States was losing in a dramatic way. Now, certainly I think from the perspective of this White House, there's a sense, what are the Russians really buying for themselves there? They will rationalize, I think, what the Russians are doing and saying, all right, let the Russians, they want to invest in Syria, let them invest in Syria. It's a loser's proposition. Putin clearly sees that he can do a lot, and the kind of reaction from the U.S. is a kind of adjustment. The Chinese see it too, so they become more assertive in the South China Seas. I don't think this administration in the White House sees it that way. I do think almost any successor, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, is going to adjust America's posture towards the outside world after this administration.
So do you agree that it may take the next president to actually tweak this policy into a different approach to global threats and global opportunities? I
think so. I think Dennis is right. And I think this administration is not going to want to wade further into the Syrian conflict. They probably see this as Russia in some ways baiting the U.S. to be more forcefully involved. And as Dennis said, this president at least not wanting to get caught in a new quagmire in the Middle East when his entire foreign policy narrative has been that he's ending the wars and certainly ending our quagmires in the Middle East from his perspective. And so I don't think that changes. What you could see, and I think this you see with a new administration, whether Democrat or Republican, is a reassessment of the strategic challenges to American power from Russia, from China, and what this means not just in the middle of these hot conflicts, but what does it mean on the margins with our friends and allies. So for example, with the Russians, what is our policy with the Baltic countries, which feel incredibly vulnerable at this stage to Russian influence, with Russia pumping in resources and influence in very dramatic ways, where the U.S. is seen as very absent. What can the U.S. do to contain Russian aggression and to demonstrate that the U.S. is willing to support our allies? As is often said, the United States wants to be the best friend to our allies and the worst enemy to our enemies. And I think any new president will want to demonstrate that. And I think the question is, how do you do that in a smart way that doesn't overreach and cause a pendular swing the other way and overcommit the U.S. in ways that we're going to regret?
Okay, gentlemen, fascinating. Thank you very much for this discussion about this fast-changing situation in Syria and American foreign policy. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول دور روسيا الجديد في الشرق الأوسط، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.